What I have noticed is that when I have conversations with journalists about my book and themes related to my book, the intersectionality of race and womanhood is never, ever discussed. Hello, and welcome to the Liberated Woman podcast, where my guests and I empower ambitious, mission driven women like you to break free from toxic productivity and embrace a joyful, satisfying life. I'm your host, Tamu Thomas, author of Women Who Work Too Much, leadership coach, and keynote speaker. In each episode, we explore personal and professional growth, featuring insightful conversations with inspiring guests, as well as episodes where I explore topics and answer your questions to support your growth and transformation. If you enjoy the show, please do like, subscribe, comment, rate, review, and share. The more listeners I reach, the more impactful guests I can attract to support your journey. Okay, let's begin. Well, hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to another episode of the Liberated Woman podcast with me, your host, Tamu Thomas, author of the book Women Who Work Too Much, coach, keynote speaker, wonderful human being, mother, sister, friend, all of those sorts of things. Today I'm here with a solo podcast episode because I want to share something that has been, or talk about something that has been on my heart for the longest time. So, if you've read my book, and if you haven't, why haven't you? If you've read my book, you will know that Women Who Work Too Much explores the systemic conditions that come together to create an environment that normalizes women working far too much in every sphere of their lives. Quite often, people think it's about the work and the workplace. And whilst it is about work and the workplace, because I think the way all human beings are conditioned to work under capitalism, and particularly the way women are conditioned to work and carry most of the domestic and emotional labor in the household and caring tasks and all of that, I think it's a huge social justice issue. It also looks at those things I mentioned, the disproportionate amount of emotional laboring we do, the caring, etc. And in my book, as a Black woman who is very aware of issues impacting Black women and women of the global majority, I speak to the nuance, particularly of being a Black woman in this society, in this world, and break down the ways, the systemic issues that are faced when you are not white are different, are amplified, and I break down the nuance. I provide evidence and all of that kind of stuff. So it's not just my lived experience, even though that is very valid and worthy and valuable. I back it up with evidence, some research and whatnot. This is the point I'm getting at. What I have noticed is that when I have conversations with journalists about my book and themes related to my book, the intersectionality of race and womanhood is never, ever discussed. On plenty of occasions, I bring it up and add it to the conversation, but I have noticed, and this isn't a criticism, it's an observation. I have been very well supported by journalists. I have had features in national print media, in glossy magazines, in national online media, all sorts. But I do note, I cannot not note, I cannot not share my observation that when it comes to the matter of race and how toxic productivity culture impacts Black women and women of the global majority differently, the discourse around that, or the willingness to have a discourse around that, the willingness to explore those themes is not there. And it's very telling. Something else I've noticed is that in some feminist spaces, white feminist spaces, there has been a bit of a not dismissal, but there was, I can't remember exactly, but somebody who is very well known, and it is not a criticism of her by any means. I'm sharing observations. There's no shaming, there's no criticism here, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to be had, because if we don't have the conversation, we don't expand our understanding, and therefore the behavior doesn't change. So there was somebody who is very well known, and she gave positive feedback about my book. But I remember reading, and she said something like, usually she would eye roll when she sees things comparing humans to stardust. Like one of the opening lines is, "We've forgotten that we're made of stardust," which we are. It's a scientific fact. And there was a reference to the flowery language in my writing. And I've had other conversations, or I've been privy to other conversations where my understanding is that white women that I'm referring to, so, let me caveat before people start getting their knickers in a bunch, not all white women. And I'm not going to keep caveating. That's the only caveat I'm giving. I'm speaking about my experience, and I'm not going to water it down by doing this, whataboutery nonsense. We are, if you're listening to this podcast, I trust that you are emotionally mature enough to be able to decipher and understand that I'm speaking from my experience. But what I have experienced is that white feminism is very much about anything a man can do, I can do better. Anything you can do better than you, whatever that is. And from my experience, if we look at the historical context in relation to women's suffrage and the fight for equality and equity in relation to gender, Black women and white women have had different fights. White women were infantilized. They were part of this being a damsel in distress, being this very delicate daisy, whereas Black women, in America, Black women were not humans until whenever, because there was that thing about Black people being 3/5 human. And the view of Black women, because of the transatlantic slave trade and because of all of the manipulation and fuckery, basically, that had to be done to justify treating human beings in the way Black people were treated, is that Black women were strong. They were manlike. They were wild, very sexual beings who had a way higher pain threshold than their white counterparts. So everything about Black womanhood was about brute strength, was about endurance, was about overcoming, was about almost being monstrous. And then when the transatlantic slave trade ended, it was about how much work we could do in service of others. So being strong but quiet with our strength. So doing back-breaking domestic work, never complaining about it, being very grateful for the opportunity to work doing this kind of manual labor, cleaning, caring type of work. Whereas white women didn't have that. When I was doing research for my book and I was looking at the marketing spin that went into women can have it all, that was part of a drive to get middle class white women into the workforce because the economy was in such a bad state in the late 70s and 80s, or in the 80s, whenever it was, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher era. That messaging had to be done to get middle class white women into the workplace because working class white women always had to work. Black women and other women of color were not in the position to not be able to work because of white supremacy, imperialism, and all of that. Many women from those types of backgrounds did not have the opportunity to be part of families that were able to create intergenerational wealth. So, this leads me to why I intentionally write the way I do. Like I can do the academic writing, right? I can do the very critical analysis. But when I was writing this book, I wanted all women who identify with my book not to feel told off or shamed or blamed. I deliberately set out to write to write this book as a love letter to the frazzled nervous systems of women. And it is even more of a love letter to the frazzled nervous systems of Black women. I intentionally chose to use spirit. I am a spiritual person. I don't do much in the way of spirituality in terms of my work because mainly my spiritual practice is mine. It is for me. But I chose to use spiritual language and spiritual references. I chose to use what has been termed as flowery language because I wanted Black and brown women, and I'll say especially Black women, because there's no other race of woman who has been conditioned for strength and endurance in the way Black women have. I wanted this book to be a gentle landing place. I wanted this book to be a place where I'm speaking truth to power, but in a manner that is sensitive and kind and holding. One of my friends and former clients, when we were working together, described my work as comforting and confronting. Isn't that just what life is? But I wanted to, I'm not into elephants in the room. I'm not into sweeping things under the carpet. I wanted to speak powerfully to the systemic issues at hand and speak in a manner that was soft and gentle and compassionate so that people felt held whilst I was speaking this truth. My impression, my experience is that white feminism encourages women to be stoic, whereas in contrast, true liberation for Black women involves and might even be centered on the ability to be soft, to be flowery, to experience ourselves as godly miracles in a world that frequently tells us we are anything but. Women, especially Black women, need a gentle landing space where they can breathe. We need the flowery language. We need to know we're made of stardust. We need to know that we are chosen and worthy. We need to know that because the world has denied this from us, has prevented us from accessing this knowledge or from being present with this knowledge by keeping us in a perpetual survival state where we believe we have no choice but to be strong. And whilst our strength is commendable, it has enabled us to make huge strides. If we are to reclaim ourselves from the trinity of oppression that creates toxic productivity culture that rinses us out, that keeps us in a state where we are defying our ancestors' dreams for us, we need to embrace the softness, the gentleness, the ease. There's, I don't see it as much, but there was a period where every Black woman was running around the internet talking about soft life. Now, a lot of what I saw wasn't soft life, it was capitalism, but I get it. Whereas for white women, liberation may come from exerting their strength, I don't believe that's the case for black women. I believe that we power up ourselves, love ourselves, care for ourselves by allowing ourselves to be gentle, to be soft, and all of those things. And whilst we do that, one of the outcomes is also that it is a beautiful act of rebellion against a system that wants us to be hard. Hard to ourselves, hard to the world, hard to everything. I'm not one of those people who says rest is rebellion and all of that kind of stuff, because I don't want us to utilize the ability to be soft and gentle as a weapon against systems of oppression. Because then we're not really taking care of ourselves and tending to our needs. We're weaponizing our ability to cultivate gentleness, etc. But I absolutely love that one of the byproducts, when we are intentional about the flowery softness, one of the byproducts is it is also a rebellion against the program that has been set for us. I speak very clearly to the nuances and differences in the ways toxic productivity impacts women differently due to race, and look at it through the prism of what I refer to as the trinity of oppression: white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. Now, what I find is that a lot of white women's feminism only focuses on patriarchy, or it includes elements of capitalism, but does not include white supremacy, definitely not in a way that makes it meaningful and not just inclusive, but makes that brand of feminism a place where black women and women of the global majority feel that there's a level of connection where they can belong inside that type of feminism. There is so much evidence out there, lots of people don't like to take black women's lived experience as enough because they are so triggered by the shame they experience when faced with white supremacy, that I made sure I was including research, etc., that highlights the difficulties experienced by black and brown women, so that the nuance, the intersectionality was clearly demonstrated throughout the book. We are conditioned to believe that we need to work twice as hard as our white counterparts to achieve the same level of recognition, because there is a factual basis for that. According to a McKinsey report, black women are less likely to feel supported at work and more likely to face microaggressions. And if you've ever experienced microaggressions, they are actually macroaggressions. There is nothing micro about them. But we are far more likely to experience microaggressions compared to our white colleagues. This is a reality. And it's a widely known reality, but it's a widely known reality that we like to sweep under the carpet. Patriarchy imposes additional burdens on black women, expecting us to fulfill traditional gender roles whilst also excelling in our careers, but not living up to the stereotype of the strong black woman in a manner that seems aggressive. So then, in addition to all of that, we need to suppress ourselves. We need to suppress our vulnerability because we can't afford to look weak, but we need to suppress our strength because we can't afford to look aggressive either. There's a article that's gone viral about black women suppressing themselves, causing autoimmune and chronic illness. I've seen it all over the internet. The article, I'm going to link it in the show notes, has been so popular. I haven't been able to read the article because the website crashes all the time. So we're constantly juggling, not wanting to be not wanting to seem to be too strong, not want to seem to be weak. There's just so many things at play. And this inability to be who we are leads to chronic stress, anxiety. It means that we are preventing ourselves from living into our true potential because we're constantly playing up to or avoiding playing into stereotypes with respectability politics, and also, making sure that we're centering whiteness. I wrote a post about this on LinkedIn the other day. I'll also link it in the show notes. But it's tiring. It's really tiring. And that strength that we are forced to embody, it is exhausting in a way I can't even articulate, like I can feel it in the pit of my stomach. And it's isolating because at the same time, we are conditioned to be hyper independent, to not ask for help, to not say when we're experiencing difficulty for the reasons I've stated above. And then capitalism, which values people based on their productivity, we become commodities, not citizens. Everything is about our output, nothing about what we gain, nothing about our well-being. It pressures Black women to continuously strive for success. We keep talking about Black excellence. I'm like, forget Black excellence. I don't want it. Let me be Black and mediocre. That's when I will know that real progress is being made. But we're often having to work at the expense of our needs in a way that is amplified because of the intersections of white supremacy and patriarchy alongside the capitalism. It becomes a relentless pursuit, which is a survival tactic. In my book, I discuss how the pursuit of success can lead to a perpetual state of not enoughness that ravages our life force energy. And this is amplified when you are not white. That post I talked about on LinkedIn, it was all part and parcel of the exhaustion that comes from assimilation. I learnt that one of the ways I can try to protect myself from racial discrimination is to assimilate. And that looked like not making a fuss. It meant masking my hurt, my anger, my upset by opting for highly intellectual responses and quoting all kinds of academic research when I had been wounded by these so-called microaggressions, which are actually macro, especially as microaggressions happen all the time. It meant that I was too afraid to stand up for myself in a manner that was assertive because I didn't want to be deemed as a troublemaker, aggressive, one of those Black women. All of those things that come, I didn't want to be perceived as the angry Black woman. So I almost watered down how I advocated for myself, adopting this very intellectual, sterile way of being so that I could educate people, not hurt their feelings, because heaven forbid I hurt the feelings of a white person who has discriminated against me, which is all part and parcel of good girl conditioning that taught me to prioritize being convenient to others. And in the context of race, good girl conditioning was understanding that I couldn't make white people feel uncomfortable, especially when it came to matters of race. And this stemmed from a fear of being seen as quote unquote bad. Because I know from what I've witnessed and personally experienced that upsetting white people can have serious consequences for me. Being difficult was something I learned to avoid at all costs. So combine this with the kind of subconscious expectation for Black women to be everyone's mammy, it created such a burdensome, exhausting reality. And it's painful as well, because although you might not realize it consciously, I didn't realize it consciously at first, it's self-betrayal, it's self-abandonment. And that shit hurts. It hurts to the core. Because if there's anybody that should not be abandoning you, it's you. But unfortunately, this good girl conditioning is predicated on your ability to abandon yourself. So, embracing softness and flowery language, whilst the intention is not to be an act of resistance, is definitely part of self liberation for Black women who have been conditioned to be perpetually strong and resilient because of the history of being dehumanized and subjected to brutal conditions. I use the tone I use in my book intentionally because I want us, particularly Black women, to embrace softness and gentleness. I want us to reclaim our humanity and assert our right to be seen as complex, emotional beings who are sensitive, who are fragile. These are words that used to make me heave. The thought of me being sensitive and fragile gave me the ick. But that was the growth edge I needed. Softness and spiritual practices in the context of Black women help us to reconnect with our inner selves and recognize our divinity, which is a powerful antidote to the historical narrative we've all been faced with or all been part of. By embracing traits that are traditionally seen as weak, overtly feminine, what I just talked about, the being fragile, the sensitivity, the vulnerability, by reclaiming that, by allowing ourselves to be whole, we come home to ourselves. And one of the outcomes, as I touched on before, is that it challenges the stereotypes that have been laid upon us. It bucks against the status quo that just wants us to be inside this strong Black woman narrative all the time. This act of defiance is liberating because it allows us to define our identity on our own terms. It's so important. I cannot emphasize it enough. Today, Black women continue to encounter systemic barriers in education, employment, healthcare, everywhere. The societal expectation for us to just be strong persists, which often leads to the neglect of our mental, emotional, it leads to the neglect of our health holistically. I refuse to do that. Intersectionality, which is what I referred to earlier on, is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is so badass. And it explains, it implores us to understand how different forms of oppression intersect and compound the experience of people who are marginalized. Intersectionality provides a framework to understand how various aspects of a person's identity interact and contribute to their unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. That's from my book. True feminism must be intersectional in order to address the diverse struggles faced by all women, particularly those from communities that are historically and systemically marginalized. Without intersectionality, feminism risks becoming exclusive and perpetuating the very systems of oppression it seeks to dismantle. I refer to it as we don't want feminism, which is patriarchy in a midi dress and trainers. So I've talked about white feminism. What is that? It refers to a form of feminism that centers the experiences and perspectives of white women, and it often neglects the unique struggles of women of color, or as I prefer to say, women of the global majority. And this narrow focus overlooks critical issues such as systemic racism, such as economic inequality and other forms of discrimination that affect women of the global majority disproportionately because of racism. According to Harvard's Business Review, Black women are significantly underrepresented in leadership positions, with only 1% of executives at the top 3,000 companies being Black women. That's a stat from Harvard Business Review Working Knowledge. I'll put the link so that you can do your own research if you choose to. Or you can just listen to a Black woman. For feminism to be about true liberation, not just about having what men have, because men are not liberated either. Even though they've got a lot of privileges, they are not liberated. For feminism to be about true liberation, it must be intersectional. And this means recognizing and addressing the ways race, class, sexuality, and other identities impact women's experiences. Intersectional feminism is about dismantling all forms of oppression, not just those related to gender. Intersectional feminism is about dismantling all forms of oppression, not just the ones that impact individuals personally. It's about the rights of the LGBTQIA plus community. It's about people with disabilities. It's about all sorts. So when we talk about feminism through a very Eurocentric, narrow lens, it's missing the point. When we talk about my book and neglect one of the central themes, which is intersectionality and how toxic productivity conditioning impacts Black women in a much more disproportionate way, we're missing the point. And again, this isn't about calling anybody out. It's much more about calling people in. If we really want to make progress, if we really want to be the change we want to see in the world, if we really want feminism to be about liberation, we have to begin with the most marginalized of us all. I conclude that if we want feminism to be about liberation, it has to be intersectional. Otherwise, it's missing the point. And I'm not calling out, I am calling in. Journalists, the ones I have been in contact with, you have been wonderfully supportive. And I would absolutely love the opportunity to have discourse and dialogue about the ways in which toxic productivity culture and the impact of an environment that normalizes women who work too much is amplified, is disproportionate for women of the global majority, especially Black women. As always, I'm open to your thoughts, what's present for you, what lands with you. You can hit me up on Instagram, which is where I play the most in the social media world, at tamu.thomas. Or if you're one of my LinkedIn folks, hit me up in the messages in LinkedIn. And if you like this episode, please do rate and review 5 stars, if you will. And if you've read my book and you haven't left a review yet, I kindly ask that you do leave a review on Goodreads and Amazon, wherever it is you bought the book. That would be absolutely wonderful. But that's it for now. Until next time, take wonderful care. Goodbye. Thank you for joining me on the Liberated Woman podcast. Your time and attention is valued. I hope you found today's conversation insightful, inspiring, and even galvanizing. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, rate, review, subscribe, comment, and share. Like many things in our digital experience, the algorithm rules, so your interaction is vital. Your support helps me reach more listeners and attract impactful guests. Tune in for more empowering discussions and practical tips to help you live life on your own terms. Until next time, I'm Tamu Thomas, reminding you to embrace your joy. Podcast produced by me, Tamu Thomas, edited by Biongolia, podcast music by James Anderson.